In this video, I'll be ranking the genetics of Olympia legends in a tier list. Previously, I did a Mr. Olympia genetics tier list, where I ranked each Mr. Olympia champion's genetics, but now I'll expand upon that and look at some truly legendary competitors and analyze their physiques. This list looks at factors like muscle shape, bone structure, proportion, and how easily these athletes could get lean or respond to training or PEDs. Also, genetics encompass such a large scope of things that it would be hard for me to truly capture the meaning of it in this video. For that reason, take everything with a grain of salt. Another thing to remember is that everyone here has amazing genetics compared to the average person, but even among these legends, some did have more complete gifts than others, and if your favorite is not in the top tier, it does not mean by any means that they were not incredible, it just means that other factors like hard work, condition, or even timing played a bigger role in their career. The tiers in this video will range from S+ to C. S+ is for the absolute genetic freaks. S means elite genetics with minor flaws. A is very strong but not extraordinary. B is more about work ethic than pure genetic advantage. And C tier is for those who achieved greatness despite clear genetic limitations. Alright, first up, let's talk about Tom Plattz. He's best known for building arguably the most iconic legs in all of bodybuilding history. His quads were massive, deeply separated, and had that crazy sweep and density that is even rare today. From the front, his lower body was basically unbeatable, and also set the bar extremely high for future competitors. But when you step away and kind of look at the rest of his physique, the picture changes. His upper body was never on the same level. His chest, arms, and back were pretty good but lacked that same wow factor that his legs obviously had, which created a pretty noticeable imbalance. Structurally, he did not have particularly wide clavicles or the kind of round muscle bellies that you would see in more gifted competitors. While his condition and effort were always top tier, especially on leg day, the overall shape and proportions of his physique were solid but not really mind-blowing. So for this ranking, I have Tom Plattz in B tier, because even though his legs were genetically freaky and some of the best of all time, the rest of his physique did not really measure up to the same standard. Next up is Bob Paris. Bob is often considered one of the most aesthetic bodybuilders to ever step on stage. His physique had beautiful proportions, flowing lines, and a perfect balance between every muscle. He had a small waist, wider shoulders, and incredible muscle bellies that made every pose look like a statue or a piece of art. From the front, side, or back, really any angle, everything just fit together seamlessly, and he brought a level of shape and presentation that most definitely inspired generations of classic physique competitors. On the downside, Bob never had extreme mass or density of, the true mass monsters, and that did hold him back competitively. His structure was excellent, albeit not the widest of all time, and also on top of that, he did not really have any standout body parts, and that could sometimes make him look a bit out of place and undersized next to bigger competitors. Still, when you look at all the genetic gifts for the shape, symmetry, and proportion, he is nearly untouchable. All in all, I have Bob Paris easily in S tier because he had elite genetics with only minor limitations, which isn't inherently due to genetics in my opinion. Now let's go to Marcus Rule, who is one of the most impressive mass monsters of all time. Marcus had absolutely enormous biceps, some of the biggest shoulders and traps you will ever see, and a level of overall size that was simply shocking. Structurally, he was incredibly wide, with massive clavicles and thick muscle everywhere that made him look cartoonish from the front. But when you look past all that sheer size, the genetic proportions and shape really were not there. His waist was blocky, his flow between muscle groups was pretty rough, and he never had the clean lines that the best in the sport possessed. Even condition was a consistent struggle for him. He could look sharp from the front, but from behind he always held extra water and never really reached that shredded, grainy look in the glutes and hamstrings especially. So while his frame and size were undeniable, overall his genetic gifts for shape and detail were pretty limited. That's why I have Marcus Rule in the A tier, freaky in terms of mass and genetics, but lacking in the proportion, shape, and condition that other top competitors might have had. Moving on, we've got Rich Gaspari. Rich was definitely a pioneer when it came to condition and bodybuilding, and he was famous for showing up with insanely grainy detail and deep separation that few people had ever seen at the time. But when you look purely at his genetics, he did not really have many standout traits. Structurally, he was not especially wide or imposing, his frame was pretty compact, and his clavicles were narrower compared to champions like Lee Haney or the mass monsters that came later. His muscle insertions were solid but nothing exceptional, and he never carried a ton of size on his frame. What really set Rich apart, though, was his relentless work ethic and discipline to push condition to a level nobody else was willing to go to. So for this ranking, I have Rich Gaspari in the C tier, because while he was an incredible competitor, he built his success more on effort and mindset rather than on raw genetic gifts. Next is Kevin Levrone, and Kevin is one of the most genetically gifted bodybuilders of all time, and it shows from every angle. He had full, round muscle bellies everywhere, especially in the triceps and shoulders, which looked 3D even when he was relaxed. Structurally, he had a great frame with excellent balance and proportion, even if he was not quite the widest across the clavicles. His insertions were standout and helped create that dense, polished look that made him so hard to beat. At his best, his conditioning was ultra sharp with crisp separation and detail all over. The only minor weakness was that he sometimes lacked that deep intra-arm separation, from the front especially, even when he was completely shredded to the bone. Beyond shape and structure, though, Kevin was also known as a hyper-responder to performance-enhancing drugs, and he could take months off from training and then come back just a few months before the show, blow up, and look even better than ever. For all of these reasons, I have Kevin Levrone in that S+ tier, because his combination of muscle shape, proportion, and responsiveness puts him among the most genetically gifted athletes in all of bodybuilding. Also, if you guys are enjoying the video so far, a like and sub would really be awesome, as it helps out the channel tremendously. Here we have a good one, Vince Taylor. He's always been one of my favorite competitors, and a true genetic standout in multiple ways. Vince had an incredible combination of proportion, balance, and muscle shape that made him look very polished from every angle. His arms were some of the best ever, full round biceps and triceps with great separation and pop. He carried a tight midsection and stayed shredded even later in his career, which also spanned multiple decades and eras of bodybuilding. One thing that set Vince apart was how complete he looked. His calves matched up to the quads perfectly, his forearms matched up to the upper arms, and everything flowed together in a way that you really don't see much anymore. If there was one small weakness, it would be that his insertions of the outer quad sweep were never really as pronounced as some other legends, which slightly affected his overall silhouette. While I could see some people giving him S+ based on his overall balance and longevity, even a minor genetic flaw like that is enough to keep him just out of that very top range. So I think I would have Vince Taylor in the S tier, elite genetics across the board, but not quite in that absolute freak category. Next up is Branch Warren. Branch was one of the hardest working and most intense competitors ever, and his physique really showed it. He built an incredible level of density and grainy detail, especially in the legs, which were some of the biggest and most separated of all time. His conditioning was also usually pretty outstanding, with deep cuts and striations, and a grainy texture that made him look really insane on stage. But genetically, Branch had quite a few limitations. Structurally, he was not the widest, which took away from his silhouette, but interestingly enough, Branch had a pretty small waist early in his career, which made his proportions appear much more balanced, so I think his widened waist is more so the result of getting bigger, rather than genetics alone. Also, his muscle bellies were not particularly round or full, so from the front he looked dense but not especially aesthetic. His arms, especially the biceps, were a weaker body part compared to his freaky legs especially, and overall his shape never really flowed like the top-tier genetic outliers. What he did have was unmatched work ethic and the ability to get more conditioned than almost anyone else. For those reasons, I have Branch Warren in B tier. It was a physique built more on effort, condition, and attitude rather than purely standout genetics. Now let's go to Kai Greene. He was easily one of the most genetically gifted bodybuilders during his time, and Kai had all that crazy mass and width with some of the best arms and legs ever seen. His biceps were enormous and peaked perfectly, and his quads were thick, deeply cut, and pretty balanced with his upper body. Structurally, he was wide in the shoulders and lats, which gave him a pretty good silhouette that stood out in any lineup. One area that did hold him back a bit were his forearms. They never truly matched the size of his massive upper arms and did look noticeably smaller in some poses. His traps were also a weaker point. They never grew enough to blend seamlessly with the rest of his back thickness, especially in the rear double. But despite those minor flaws, Kai had the rare combination of being able to get huge and still come in very shredded, while keeping decent proportions and shape that he carried naturally from the beginning. You can debate where he lands all you want, but to me, he was clearly gifted in a lot of areas and built one of the most complete and impressive physiques of all time. Overall, I would have Kai Greene in the S+ tier because his genetic potential for size, muscle shape, and great condition were simply on another level. Moving on, we have Chris Cormier. Now, Chris was one of the most complete and balanced bodybuilders of his time. He never had that one freaky standout body part, but everything else flowed together with a level of proportion and polish that is rare even among the best. His midsection was always very aesthetic, with a clean, tight waist and a great ribcage shape that made his front shots look very classic. The quads were probably his best muscle group if I had to pick one, thick, very detailed, and balanced. He was not ultra-wide structurally, but he also was by no means narrow. He had respectable width across the shoulders and lats. On occasion, his hamstring and glute condition would lag behind, but that seemed more like a work ethic or prep detail rather than a genetic issue because there were shows where he nailed it perfectly. In my opinion, what kept him from the very top tier in this video is that he did not have the extreme roundness or that crazy freak factor in any one muscle group or the cartoonish fullness that you see in guys like Flex Wheeler. So for this ranking, I have Chris Cormier in S tier, a physique with elite genetics for shape and balance, but lacking that one mind-blowing feature that would have pushed him into that S+. Now we have Flex Wheeler. Flex is often considered to be the most genetically gifted bodybuilder of all time, and for good reason. He had incredibly round, full muscle bellies all over. His physique looked 3D from every single angle. His symmetry and proportion were basically flawless, with a tiny waist that made his already massive arms, chest, and quads look even bigger. The only structural limitation you could point to was that his clavicles were a bit narrower than some other champions, but even then it was kind of offset by his ultra-small waist and the huge delts that he would develop later on. Some people also point out that his hamstring and glute condition was never really the best, which is true, but it is important to note as well that earlier in his career, like in 1993, he was fully conditioned from head to toe, even in those areas. The issues with the lower body water retention most likely came later on as his kidney disease developed, so it's not really a pure genetic flaw. Overall, Flex had really everything: the roundness, the proportion, the shape, and the ability to get in condition when healthy. Overall, it shouldn't come as a surprise then that I have Flex Wheeler in the S+ tier, because he embodied the definition of elite genetics and set a standard for the aesthetics and muscle shape that, in my opinion, still has not been matched. Here we have Serge Bray, who is a true legend and one of the most aesthetic bodybuilders. He had a beautiful overall flow to his physique, with great balance and proportions that looked incredible in any pose. His chest was impressive, full, thick, and one of the best of his era, and he had a well-developed midsection, especially those abs, which tied everything together visually. But when you look at it closely, there were some clear limitations. Structurally, he was not the widest competitor, which hurt his taper a bit, and his outer quad sweep was not particularly dramatic, even though he posed cleverly to minimize it. His delts were also not especially rounded or dominant, and his back lacked a lot of that width, which you could see even from the front in his lats. His waist, while pretty good, was not shockingly tiny, and sometimes it even looked a bit blocky depending on the angle. A lot of this is pretty hard to judge definitively because standards for condition and muscle development were wildly different in his era, but compared to more modern physiques, Serge did not really have that one freaky body part or overwhelming feature. All in all, I think I would have to put Serge Bray in the A tier. Great aesthetics and balance for his time, but with enough genetic limitations to keep him just short of the truly elite category. Next up is Paul Delet. Now, Paul had some of the freakiest proportions and structure we've ever seen. Standing around 6'1", he was incredibly wide in the shoulders and chest, with a massive frame that made everyone else look small. His muscle bellies were full and round all over, giving him that cartoonish 3D look that almost did not seem real. He also managed to bring fantastic condition, showing clear separation and detail despite carrying so much size. His waist was also surprisingly small, for such a big competitor at least, which made his silhouette even more impressive. Most of the things that people point to as weaknesses, like his underdeveloped back or awkward posing, had to do more with training inconsistencies and a lack of practice rather than genetic shortcomings. If he had nailed those details, he probably could have been Mr. Olympia easily. When you look at his frame, muscle shape, and ability to get huge while still keeping proportion, it's obvious that he was a true genetic outlier. I think Paul Delet is easily in that S+ tier because his structure and muscle bellies put him among the most naturally gifted people, I guess, of all time. Moving on to Labrada, who was one of the most polished and aesthetic competitors of his time, and he was also known for his flawless posing and incredible presentation. Genetically, he had great proportions and balance, which is impressive considering he had a smaller frame and stood much shorter than most of his competitors. Unlike a lot of shorter bodybuilders who end up with stubbier-looking limbs, Lee had very balanced arms and legs, with clean lines that always looked very proportional. But when you look at his physique purely from a genetic standpoint, nothing really stood out. He did not have freaky insertions or that dense, round muscle look that immediately grabs your attention. What did set him apart, though, was his perfectionism. He worked tirelessly to master posing, keep everything in proportion, and show up in razor-sharp condition every single time. While he was predisposed to good limb balance and aesthetic shape, he did not have that baseline wow factor that you see in the more genetically gifted champions, in my own opinion. So for this ranking, I would have Labrada in the A tier because he had very good genetics for balance and aesthetics, but he had to work for everything else. Next is Nasser Elsamati. Now, Nasser had one of the most impressive frames in bodybuilding history, with great clavicle width and enough size to even stand toe-to-toe with Dorian Yates. Genetically, he had superb limb insertions, especially in his legs and calves, which were easily some of the best of his era. His wide structure helped balance out all that mass and kept his physique from ever looking too blocky. Overall, most of his muscle insertions were above average or pretty excellent, and he was able to pack on tremendous size while still maintaining a relatively balanced look. His conditioning was generally solid, at least from the front and side, though at times he did have trouble getting fully dialed in the hamstrings and glutes. The main reason he does not land in a higher tier for me is that he lacked that standout wow factor. Yes, he was enormous, but genetically he did not have that ultra-round, bubbly muscle that made guys like Flex Wheeler or Kevin Levrone look insane. While he did have a very imposing frame and some very solid proportions as well, there were not any body parts besides maybe those insane calves that truly looked like some of the best of all time. Even his arms, while big, did not have that freaky shape you would see in the most gifted competitors, and I'm pretty sure later on he was putting synthol in them anyways. Now, I'd have Nasser Elsamati in the S tier, genetically elite, but just missing that final level of visual impact. Now we have a rather polarizing competitor, Mike Menser. Mike was one of the most complete and balanced competitors, at least during the golden era, with a classic look that still holds up today. Genetically, he had a smaller waist, especially when he hit a vacuum, great arm insertions that made his biceps and triceps look very imposing, and rounded lats from the front with strong attachments that gave him a pretty solid V taper. But he did have some clear flaws. His outer quad insertions were not particularly dramatic, so his legs looked a bit flat from certain angles, especially from the front. And also, I would have to say that his abs were genetically not really the best. They lacked ideal insertions, which made his midsection look a bit mediocre, if not in a vacuum. Structurally, he also was not the widest in the shoulders, and overall, he did not really have an outstanding frame. For his time, he was very solid and well-rounded, but like a lot of golden era competitors, it can be hard to separate what was due to genetics versus what came down to training methods, diet, and the limited PED use and knowledge compared to later decades. Because of all that, I have Mike Menser in the A tier, a strong physique with good shape and proportion, but not quite the kind of structural gifts or standout insertions that you see in the most genetically blessed bodybuilders. Next up is Victor Martinez. Victor had one of the most complete and polished physiques of the 2000s, and at his best, like in 2007, he brought a level of pop and wow factor that made him look like a champion from almost any angle. His upper body was especially impressive for his time. His arms were full and round, his chest was thick and shredded, and his midsection had excellent ab insertions and clean definition when he was in peak condition. He could get that dense, very detailed look without sacrificing any shape, which is a rare genetic combination. But he did have some structural limitations. His frame, for example, was not the widest up top, so in poses like the front lat spread, his waist, which actually was not the widest of all time, sometimes actually would become a bit blocky and threw off the taper. Also, I do want to say that his quads were probably among his weaker body parts. They were not bad by any means, but they did not really have that dramatic outer quad sweep. Apart from those areas, though, most of his physique was consistently above average to excellent in terms of the overall genetics that he was given. Now, overall, I'd have to say that Victor Martinez would land in that S tier. He had elite muscle shape, proportions, and density, just missing that extreme structure or standout feature that would push him into the S+. Moving on to Lee Priest, Lee is easily one of the most genetically gifted bodybuilders when it comes to pure muscle building ability. He was even massive as a teenager, and over time, he developed some of the best arms ever seen on a pro stage. His triceps, biceps, and even the forearms were all world class, and from the front, his quads were thick, detailed, and balanced perfectly with the rest of his physique. His abs also had excellent insertions, his calves were fully developed and lowly inserted, and overall he brought a level of freak factor that very few competitors could match. Genetically, he was built to pack on all that muscle, but in my opinion, his main limitation was structural. He had rather narrow clavicles, which combined with his shorter stature, made his frame look a bit more compact and less imposing. While height alone is not necessarily a disadvantage, having both a smaller height and narrower shoulders does limit how wide and dramatic your silhouette can look. Since structure plays such a big role in how a physique flows, I do have to knock down a point for that, even though everything else about his genetics was spectacular. So for this ranking, I would have to have Lee Priest in that S tier, an elite muscle builder with a crazy proportion, just held back ever so slightly by a less impressive overall frame. Here we have Ferrigno, who is an icon of the golden era and later came back in the 90s with a much more developed modern look, which definitely makes it easier to see both his strengths and his limitations. Genetically, he had some of the most impressive pecs of all time, massive, thick, and perfectly shaped, and even rivaled Arnold in that sense, and his arms were also huge and looked great in most poses. But one of his biggest challenges was his height. At around 6'5", he was almost too tall for bodybuilding, and while that does sound a bit strange, it made it extremely difficult to pack on enough dense muscle to fully fill out his frame the way someone like Dorian Yates could. That wasn't as noticeable in the 70s when they weren't as big, but by modern standards, it was definitely a huge disadvantage. He also had a few other smaller weaknesses. His outer quad sweep wasn't especially pronounced. His arms as well, while big, had relatively shorter insertions due to his upper arm bone just being so big, and on top of that, his waist was a bit wide, though it was partly balanced out by his massive clavicle width. That all said, I do have Ferrigno in that A tier. He had a lot of strong genetic gifts, especially his chest and immense width, and many would consider his height outside of bodybuilding to be something to die for, but in bodybuilding, his extreme height and some other structural limitations as well as insertions kept him from the very top category, even during his comeback. Second to last is Gunter Schleppel, who was one of the biggest and most impressive mass monsters of all time, and genetically speaking, he did have a lot going for him. His arms and quads were both excellent, thick, balanced, and very detailed, and his chest was massive and well developed. His back was actually underrated, with solid lat insertions that gave him good width from behind. Structurally, he was extremely wide across the shoulders, which created a big, commanding silhouette. He also had consistently great condition, with very thin skin looking, detail all over, which helped him stand out against other massive competitors. That all said, the biggest weakness in his physique has got to be the midsection. Even though he did have pretty good ab insertions, his waist was on the wider side, and his obliques, which were the biggest offender here, tended to spill over the sides, especially in poses like the ab and thigh. That awkward midsection often distracted from the upper body width and great detail and overall size and insertions in the legs. He also was not the most aesthetic competitor because of it, as his shape leaned more towards sheer size than flowing lines. Overall, I would have Gunter Schleppel in the S tier, a genetic powerhouse with outstanding mass and structure, held back mainly by a blockier midsection. Finally, we have Shawn Ray. Shawn was quite possibly the most balanced competitor of all time. While Flex Wheeler is often called the Sultan of Symmetry, Shawn easily could have been the Prince of Proportion. Everything about his physique was in perfect balance, his insertions were nearly flawless from top to bottom, and his consistently amazing condition only made them more obvious. He was never the biggest or the widest competitor ever, and he was definitely on the shorter side, but that did not stop him from beating much larger competitors and being one of the most consistent bodybuilders ever. Despite his stature, he was not narrow, and every pose showcased a level of detail, roundness, and flow that looked straight up spectacular. His midsection was especially impressive, one of the best of all time, with tight, very well inserted abs, clean lines, and no real weak angles. He had that wow factor in how complete and polished he looked, from the fullness of his muscle to the intricate detail he brought every time he stepped on stage. So for the final ranking, rounding out the list, I have Shawn Ray in the S+ tier, because he had nearly perfect genetics for shape, proportion, and detail that very few athletes have ever come close to. Anyways guys, that about does it for this video. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts and opinions, as well as anything else. With that all being said, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.